Hello and welcome. In this lesson, you will learn how to create forms in your HTML document. At the end of the lesson, you should know how to create a sign up, a contact us, and a registration form for your web pages. Let's get started. So, what is a form? In HTML, a form is a structure that will allow users to input data, and this data will be sent to the server for processing. On a web page or a website, functionalities like user registration, login, and search queries are all made up of forms. So how do we create a form in our HTML document? To create a form, you will need the following elements. You will need a form element, a form control element, a label element, and a button element. Let's look at what these elements mean and their functionality. We'll start with the form element. So what is the syntax for the form element? You will need an opening form tag and a closing form tag. So this becomes the syntax that you need to create your form. Now, why do we need this syntax? The form element normally acts as a wrapper for the form. This means the form element will group all the form controls inside it. So every data that you'd want the user to enter would be wrapped around this form element, which is the opening form element and the closing form element. So in between the opening and the closing form element, you will have all your form controls, which are the data that the user can enter to be submitted to the server. Now, inside your form element, you would usually have a button. When the button is pressed, all the data that has been captured by the form control would be submitted to the server for processing. We've learned that the form element serves as a wrapper around your form control. So let's learn about form control. So what are form controls? The form control element is what allows the user to choose or enter some data, which will be sent to the server when the form is submitted. So any element that would allow the user to enter some data or to select some data to be sent to the server becomes a form control element. Now, there are various variations of this form control element, and so we'll go through each of them, and we should know what the intent of that form control element is. The very popular form control element you would need when building your form is the input element. The input element, which has this syntax, enables users to accept data or enable you to accept data from the user. So it is this input element that you would have inside your form element to enable any user to your website enter some data. Now, based on the type attributes that you would add to this input element, it can serve various functions. We would look at it during the hands-on approach, meaning that this input element can serve as a control to enter a user's text, so first name, last name, etc. This same input element can serve as a control to enter a number only. So you could enter your phone number, for instance. This input element, when we add the type or we specify the type attribute, we can capture the password of a user. So the input element can serve as a password. The input element can also be used as a checkbox. This same input element can serve as a radio button. So the use of this input element would vary based on a type attribute that you specify when you write your input element. We'll look at that during the implementation. Another form control element you would come across is the text area element. Now this is useful when you want to allow users to enter some sizable amount of text. So for instance, you are building a contact us page and you want the user to enter the reason or a message that indicates why they are contacting you, then you will need a text area element for it. Or you are building a web page that allows users to enter comments or reviews, then you will need a text area input element. So anytime you want to enter a sizable amount of text, the sure element to use is the text area element. So what if you want the user to select some items on your web page? Then you would need the select element, because the select element provides the users with a menu of options to select from. So anytime you build a form that you'd want the user to select, probably from a drop down, then you would need this select control element in your form element. When you are building forms, you would want to guide the user as to what data they should enter, and so you would need a label element. The label element provides a caption for an item in your user interface. For instance, you can have a label for first name, you can have a label for email, you can have a label for phone number when you are building your form, and you would need that label element in order for you to achieve that purpose. Now you know about the form element and the various types of form controls that you can have in your form. Let's put all of these concepts together and create a sign-up form. What will our sign-up form contain? It's basically going to be a form that allows a user to create an account on our web application. Now on the web page, these are the details we are capturing from the user. On our page, we want the user to enter his or her full name. We want to capture the email address of the user. And then we want to give the user the option to set a password to his or her account. And then the last option is for the user to confirm the initial password that he or she entered. Then lastly, we are going to have a button that when clicked will send the data to our server for processing. So now that we know how our form is going to be structured, let's see how to build it. We'll jump right into our code editor and we'll start building this sign up form. In this folder, I have created the signup.html file, and I have my boilerplate code or my initial code that I want to set up before writing the elements that I'll need for the form, right? So this is the body of my HTML document, and this body is currently empty. This is where I'm going to define my form element as well as all the form controls that I will need. So how do we proceed? We've learned that in order for you to create a form, you will need the form element. The form element is going to wrap all your form controls. So let's write our form element. What is the syntax for the form element? You will need your opening form tag and the closing form tag. So this becomes your form element. Now all your form controls, remember that the form controls are the data that you want to capture, the user data that you want to capture. So all the form controls would be inside these form elements. Okay, now before we start, let's give our form a heading. So I'm going to write an H2, and then I'm just going to give it a name, create an account. So this is going to be the description for my form, right? Now after this heading, I would now want to define my form controls based on the user interface or the design that we have. We would need to capture the user's full name, email address, password, and confirm password. And so we need to capture 4 items of the user in order to successfully create an account on our web application. Let's stay a bit more on the form element and talk about some attribute that is required for the form element before we proceed to capturing the user's data. Now this form element can have many attributes. The 2 most important attributes that we would look at is the action and the method attribute. So within the opening form tag, you can have an action attribute. So let's give our form an action attribute. Now this action attribute would point to the path or the page you would want the form to be submitted to, so that it can be processed by the server. You know, when you click on a button to submit the form, all this data that you've captured from the user need to be sent to another page for the processing to begin. So the action is where you indicate the path that the form needs to be submitted to. So in our case, we just going to indicate that when this form is submitted, send all of this data to a page called, let's give it a name, submit underscore page. So this should be another page that we have to define in our project directory, so that when the form is submitted, it takes the user to this submit page, then the processing will begin. However, I will not go into details as how the server is going to process the form. So we're just going to submit it to this form, and then that will be it. The next attribute that we would require in this form element is the method attribute. So in the method attribute, I specify the value get. Great. Now we can proceed to capture the user's data. We would wrap each of the data to be captured in a paragraph tag. So first, let's have a p tag. So I'm going to have my opening p tag and the closing p tag. Now, why am I having a p tag here? We would want the data to be captured, or the form controls to be on separate lines. And so once we put the form controls inside this p tag gives us a block level element. It help us to ensure that the the data is on a separate line. So within this p tag, we'll have our label, right? So let's have our label tag here and the closing label tag. Why do I need a label? The label element describes the data that needs to be entered in my form control. So I can give any text I want to this label, but it needs to describe the data I'm expecting the user to enter. So here I'm going to give it a label called full name, so that when this form is displayed on my web page, the user would instantly know I want to capture the full name in my form control. The label element also accepts an attribute that helps us associate whatever form control that we would create to this label that we have. So the attribute is the for attributes, and then the value would be the name I want to give to this form control. So I can still write here full name as my for. So what is the next step that we want to take? After your label, the next element that you need is your form control element. So we come to the end of this label element and then have our first form control element. So we're going to use this input element as our form control. So this is the syntax for writing your form control. The form control is what helps us to capture the user's data. From our design, we would want the user to enter their full name. So this form control, this input here is capturing the user's full name. How do we do that? Now from our slides, we learned that every form control can have a type attribute. The type attribute is what helps us know the particular data we want to capture. So here I'm going to have a type attribute here, and then I'll write test. Why test? What this means is that in this form control, I want to capture a text so the user can enter his full name in the form control. So that's the first thing that I will need here. So this becomes the first attribute I would need here. What is the next attribute I would need? I would also need the name of this form control. So I'm going to have a name attribute and then give this form control a name. So I'm going to write full name as the name of this form control. Why do I need a name attribute? The name attribute helps us to specify the name for the data we are capturing. So when the form is submitted, it is going to submit it in a name value pair. What does this mean? Whatever text that the user would enter in this form control would be associated with the name I've given to this form. So this name that I've written here, full name, can be any name that specifies that this is the data item that I'm submitting to the server. To avoid confusion, I'm just going to change this full name to full underscore name so that it is distinguished from the full name. Okay, let me go back and then explain these two attributes before I add the additional attributes. What are we capturing? We want to capture the user's full name. So in this form control, which is an input element, we are specifying the type to be text. This will indicate to our web browser that we want to capture a text. Now remember that this input control can vary, meaning we can capture a number, we can capture an email, we can capture a password, we can capture a checkbox. So the input control has a lot of variation that we can use to capture various data the user can enter on a form. So the text here indicates that I want to capture a text from the user. The next one is a name. I'm specifying a name for this data item. The data I'm entering, what name have I given to it? So the name I've given to this data I'm going to capture is full name. Let's move on to the next attribute I will need. I will need an ID attribute. So let me write an ID attribute. And what will this ID attribute contain? The ID attribute is how I'm going to link the label to this form control. Now, on a web page, when a user click on this label, full name, it can instantly highlight the input control, which is this form control, so that the user can quickly enter some data. So the ID I'm giving here should be associated or should be the same as the for value. Whatever data I've entered here should be the same data I'm going to enter here. So I'm going to now write my full name as my ID attribute. The last attribute I would need is the required attribute. What is the required attribute for? What this does is that I am forcing the user to enter some data in this form control before the form can be submitted to the server. In other words, this form control cannot be blank. I need the user to enter some data before the user can successfully submit the form. That is the essence of the required attribute. Let's proceed to capture the user's email address. So I'm going to have a paragraph tag or a p tag, and then within that p tag I would need two elements, a label element and an input element. Let's have a label element. So I'm going to have a label element and I'm going to label the form control. So I'm going to say email, so that the user knows they need to enter their email in this form control. This label needs a for attribute, so the value for this for would be email. Next, I would have my form control, so I would need my input element. Now, what does this form control need? This form control would still need a type attribute, a name attribute, an ID attribute, and a required attribute. So let's start with the type attribute. So I have my type attribute here, and the question I would want to ask is, what do I want the user to enter, or what am I capturing this time around? I'm capturing the user's email. So this type attribute will no longer be text, but it will be email. Please take note, we are capturing email. Anytime you want to capture a user's email on your web page, please ensure your input control has a type attribute with a value of email. This will force the user to enter an email address before they can submit the form. Then I'll need to give a name to this data item. So I would have my name attribute, and then I say this is email. Let me just write email address. So the name of this form control, or the name for the data I'm capturing, is email address. I will need an ID. The ID attribute should match with the 4 attributes in my email. So I'm going to have an ID attribute, and the value, what is inside my quote, should be the same thing that I have here. So I'm just going to write email here. Okay, so I have linked, I've associated my email, the label email, with this form control with an ID of email. So this ID should always match the value that you have here, or just duplicate. Anything that you write here should be the same thing that you would write in your ID. Lastly, if I require the user to enter his or her email before he or she can proceed to submit the form, then I would need the required attribute. So I'm just going to have a required attribute here, and that should be enough to have my email input element up and running. We would need the user to also enter the password and then confirm the password. So let's proceed with that one. I'm going to have a paragraph element. Remember, I indicated that the paragraph element helps the form controls to be on a separate line. That is why I'm putting the label and the input in a paragraph element, so that it looks nice on the web page. So here I'll need my label, close the label, and then because I want the user to enter password, I will say probably password. Then the 4 attribute would have password as well. This can be any text though. I'll need my input element. Now the type attribute would vary this time round. Because I want to capture the user's password, the type attribute would no longer be email or text, but it will be password. So this type attribute becomes password. The name for this input, I'm giving it the same name, let's say password. The ID for this input element would be password. Always remember, whatever you enter here in the ID attribute should be the same thing that you've entered in your 4 attribute. So don't be confused by the repetition of the password in my input control. Do I require the user to enter the password? Yes, so I'm going to have a required attribute here. Lastly, we want to confirm the password, so we are putting it in a paragraph element so that it is on a separate line. We'll need a label. The label indicates to the user what we want them to enter. So here I'm just going to write confirm password as my label. This label would need a 4 attributes, so I write my 4 and then I say confirm and let me write this time around the camel case password. right? After the label, I'll need my input control, so my input element. So we are using the same input element, however the type would differ. So most forms are built using the input element. The variation in the type is what makes it different. So what data am I capturing? I want a password, so I'm going to use a password type. What's the name of this input element? I'm going to give it a name of confirm underscore password. What is the ID? The ID should match the 4 attributes here. So ID, and then inside my quote, I am repeating the same value that I have here. So confirm password. Let me pick it from here. Is this password required? Then I give it a required attribute. So now we have the 4 data item we want to capture when a user wants to create an account. We want the user to enter their full name, their email, password, and confirm the password. Lastly, we'll need a button element. Remember, the button element is what helps the user to submit the form to the server for processing. So below our last paragraph element, I'm going to have my button element, an opening and a closing button tag. Then here, the text I want to display on the button. So I'm just going to write sign up now as my text. Okay, so this is our complete form. Let me just zoom out for you to see the entire structure. This is our complete form. We have our form element, which is wrapping all our form controls. We started with our heading. We just want to give this form a heading. So we have a create an account heading. Then the data that we want to capture is in a paragraph element, so that every data we want to capture is on a separate line. So the data will have a label that is specifying the name that I want to give to this form control. So I'm just saying, hey, here I want to capture your full name. So the label here is just indicating to the user, I want to capture your full name. Then I have my input element. The type is text. I want you to enter a text. The name of this input element is full underscore name. The ID is full name. This ID should be the same as the value you have in your form. And yes, this input element is required, meaning the user will have to enter their full name before they can submit the form. That is the essence of this required attribute. And the same logic is repeated here. However, here the type attribute is email. What this would force the user to do is that they need to enter a valid email before they can proceed. So if the user enters a number, it's going to prompt the user to enter an email, a valid email, meaning that we have probably emmanuel@gmail.com. That becomes a valid email format. Then we go to the next one. We want to capture the password. So the type here becomes password. We want to capture another password. So we have a type attribute being a password. And lastly, how do we submit this form? We need a button element with a text set up now. So let's go to our web page and see how this form look like. So once we reload our signup.html in our web browser, we should see this form created for us. We are capturing the full name, which is the label we've given to it, and then this is the data that we need to fill out. This is a box for the data we need to fill out. We have a label for email. to indicate to the user to enter their email. We have a label for password, and here we need a password to be entered. We have a label for confirm password, telling the user to confirm the password they've written here. And then there's a button element that will submit our data to the page that we set in the form action. Okay, so let's see if this form is going to work. So I have my full name, and I'm writing my full name, Emmanuel. Oh, okay, so let me just pick this one. Great. Next, I go to my email label, and then I can enter my email. So I'll just say someone @gmail.com. Then I want to capture the user's password. So let's assume I'm the user. I want to enter my password for creating this account on the web page. So in the password field, I can enter my password here. Now notice something interesting. I can't see the password I'm entering. Why? Because in that input element for the password, we set the type attribute to password. Let me go back to the code and show you what I mean. Because I set my type attribute to password, that is why the user cannot see the password that they are entering. Now this is a good measure so that anyone that is looking on your web page as you are typing your password the password will not be visible to that user, for the user to use to steal your credentials and then probably use it to log into your account. So whenever you want the user to enter a password, always ensure you have the type attribute with a value of password. So a password attribute will not be visible to the user. And then we have a confirm password, which is going to follow the same syntax. So whatever data the user enters will not be visible. There is a process for you to turn the password on or off. However, we are not going to discuss it in this lesson. Lastly, we have the sign up now button. Once the user clicks on this sign up now, all the data that has been entered in this form controls would be sent to the page that we specified, or the path we specified in our form action. Let me show you what I mean. In our form, we have an action attribute with a value of submit page. So when this button element is clicked, all the data we are capturing, all the user's data, will be sent to a page called submit_page. So that is the path that this data we've captured from the user should be sent to, for it to be processed and then later sent to the server. Okay, so let's submit our data. I click on the sign up now button, and the data is submitted. Why do we have this error here? Because we don't have a submit_page file. That is why we have this data here. But let me see if I can show you something interesting. When you closely look at what we have in our browser, you'll notice we have a full name with a value. This is the value that we've entered, the user entered. We have an email address. Email_address here is the name we give to that input element, and then the value we have here is what we entered. So that is the essence of the name attribute we give to our form controls. The name would be shown in the URL, and whatever data the user entered would be associated with that name. So this is the name value pair that is seen in our browser. In this session, we'll focus on creating a contact us form for our web page. So what would the form look like? So we are capturing 4 data items: full name, email, subject, message. The full name would use the input element. Email will use an input element with a type set to email. Subject will use an input element. Because we are entering a test here, the type is going to be test. The only change we would have is here. Because we want the user to enter a large block of text, we would now change the element we want to use. Here, we would use the test area element. Finally, there's a button for the user to click on to submit our form. So this is our contact us HTML document, and we want to create a form that allows the user to contact us for maybe their next project. How will we go about it? First, we will need the form element. The form element is going to wrap all our form controls. So let's go here and then write our form element. Inside the form element is where we specify our label element and then our input control. Now we said this form element would have an action attribute. The action attribute is the path or the page you'd want to submit the data that has been captured to for processing. So I'm going to write my action attribute and then indicate the path. So when this form is submitted, take the user to, let's say, thank you. So take the user to a page called thank you. The next attribute we need in this form element is the method. So how are we transmitting the data? So I'm going to see method here, and then I'm going to give it a get value. After you've created your form element, you now need to have your form controls. Now we want each of the data item to be on a separate line. So it is recommended to use a block level element. So we can use a paragraph element or a div element, and then inside that div element we'll have our label element and input element. So let's use div element instead of the paragraph we use for the sign up form. So I'm going to have a div element here. Then inside this div element, I want to specify my label and then the form control. So I have my label element, and the first thing that we want the user to enter is their full name. So I'm going to give this name, this label, the full name label. This is indicating to the user that we want him or her to enter their full name. Then this label will have a 4 attributes. So I have a 4 attributes here, and then I'll give it a name. Maybe this time I'm just going to write name as a 4 attributes. Now after your label, you will need your form control. That is the element that is going to capture the user's data. So here I have my input element. This input element will have different attributes. This time I'm going to add one more attribute to what we initially did. So the type attribute, the full name is going to be a test. So the type attribute has a value of test. The name attribute, what is the name I'm giving to this data item? I want to give this one a full underscore name. as a name attribute. Then what do I need next? Let me introduce a placeholder attribute. Now this placeholder would display some text in my input element to enable the user know what they need to enter. So I'm going to just write enter your full name, enter your full name. So there's just a placeholder that is guiding the user that in this input element or on the web page, I want you to enter your full name here. And then I would have my ID attribute. So ID, now always this ID, the value here should match the 4. So ID here becomes name. This is important because when you click on this label, the full name label, you'll notice that you can quickly enter text in your input element without necessarily clicking on the input element. Then I will have my required attribute because the user needs to enter their full name before they can submit their form. So I'm done with my first data item. The next one I want the user to enter is their email. So I'm just going to have another div. Then within this div, I'm going to have a label that will just indicate to the user I want them to enter their email. So here I'm just going to say email. This label will have a for attribute, and then I write my email as my for attribute. Then next I will need my input element. So I'll have my input element here. What type of input am I capturing? I'm capturing email. So type here, the value for this type would be email because I'm capturing email. What's the name of this data item? The name I'm giving to this is email address, just for it to distinguish between the email that I have. Do I need a placeholder? Yes, I want a placeholder that guides the user what exactly they want to enter. So enter your email address. Then I will need an ID. The ID, the value here should be the same for the label. So ID here becomes email. And then, yes, I want the user to enter their email before submitting the form. We've created the full name and then email data item. So let's move on to the next one. We want the user to enter the subject of the email. So in between this div, I'm going to have a label that I'm going to write subject. Then this label will have a for attribute. I give it a value of subject. I move on to the data item, what I want to capture. So it's still going to be an input element. I want a text. So the type here would be a text. The name for this input element would be subject. So you always need a name attribute so that they know the name for this data item you are capturing. Placeholder, I'm just going to write enter the subject of the email, and I want this to be a required attribute, so I'm just going to put the required attribute there. Right, lastly, we want to capture the message. So this is what differentiates what we are doing from what we previously did. So I'm still going to have my div element. Inside a div element, I'm having my label. The label I'm giving to the data item is message. I have my for attributes. So in this for, I just say message. Then this is where we have some differentiation from what we are doing. We want the user to enter a block of text, so we can't use the input element as our form control. So this time around I'm using test area. So I'm just going to have test area. The last thing I would want here is a button element that would help me to submit the form to the server. So in this button element, I'm just going to have the text send. And this should be the structure for our contact us form. A form element, and then we are wrapping the form element around our label and input element. We are capturing a full name, email, subject, and then a message from the user. So let's go to our web page and then see how our form would look like. All right, so this is our contact us page that we've built. We are not focusing on CSS now, so don't worry if the form doesn't look pretty. When we start learning about CSS, we'll come back to this form and install it. So are we capturing the right data item? We have a full name field, email field, subject field, and the message field. You notice that this message has a different height compared to this input element, because here in the message we are using a text area. So let's try out this form. Full name, I'm still giving my full name, email, samuel@gmail.com, subject, domain transfer test. Hi team, kindly assist transfer my domain to a different host. So you see here I have the option to enter a large chunk of text, right? That is the essence of the text area element. Now when I click on this send button, it's going to now capture all this user's data and then send it to the path that I specify in my form action. And then for each of these inputs, we're going to have the name and the data that has been entered that will showcase in my browser URL. So let's click on this send button here, and then you see, because you don't have our thank you page, we are just having this error. But when you look closely at our URL, you see that all the data that we've entered is showing in the URL. Let's modify this form to factor in a radio button and then a checkbox. So let's just say we want a checkbox that needs to be checked before the form can be submitted. How do we do that? So here we can have a div, and then here inside a div we'll have a label that we're just going to say consent. Or let's say consent here. Then this is where the magic will happen. We're going to have our input element. Here the type would now change, so the type becomes checked. So how do we add a checkbox to this form? We are still going to have our input element. In the type attribute, the value will now be checkbox. Once the browser sees this value in the type attribute, he knows that it needs to render a checkbox. The other attributes remain the same, so we can have an ID that says consent. We can have a label, a name for this checkbox, so the name for this checkbox now becomes agree, right? And then if this checkbox is required, we're going to have a required attribute. So let me scroll down for you to see. So the same structure that we are following, however, we are changing the type here to be checkbox so that we can display a checkbox on our web page. So let's go to our web page and see if we have our checkbox rendered. Okay, so we are back to our contact us page, and as you can see, we've added our consent, which is a checkbox that can be checked and then unchecked, right? So this is really how to add a checkbox to your form. Let's just add an option that allows the user to select how they got to know about us before they submit the form. So we are going to add a select element to our form. Let's dive right in. So how do we go about that? I would have my select element, then I'm going to wrap my select element around my option element. The option element indicates the various options that the user can select before they submit the form. So let's dive right in. I'll have my select element. Then within this select element we'll have my various options. But first, let me give a name to this select element. So the name here becomes referral. Then I'll have my various options that a user can select. So I'll have my options element. Inside this option element, I will indicate the text I want to display to the user. So the text here, maybe I'll just write, please select an option. Now this option element would always accept a value attribute. The value attribute is the value that you'd want to set the option to. That is what you want the user to select. So if I don't want the user to select anything, I'm just going to have my value attribute and then set it to empty. When we go to the web page, you would notice how we implemented this or why we have this empty value. Then the next is the options that the user can select. So what are my referral options? Probably it's from Facebook, it's from Google, it's from another website. So I'm going to have 3 options. So option 1 that the user can select would be Facebook. So this is how the user got to know about us, Facebook. And in the value, in the option opening tag, I'll have my value attribute. Then this value would be Facebook. So whatever the user selected, this is the value, Facebook. I'm going to have my next option element. Within the opening and closing tag, I'm going to write my option that the user would see. So I say Google as my option. I'll come to my opening option tag, have my value attribute, and then set the value to Google. Then lastly, I'll have my third option that the user can select. So we have my opening option tag, my closing option tag, and here what I want to indicate is external website. So I'll go to my opening option tag, and the value I'm going to give to this will be external. Let me write it the same. So external website. All right, so this is how we can give users of our site options to choose from before they submit the form. Let's go to our web page and then see how this looks like. All right, so this is our contact us page that has been reloaded, and we can see we have our option, the ability for the user to select an option before submitting the form. So we say please select an option, and when you click on it, these are the various options that the user can select. So once I click on Facebook, then this is the value that will be sent to the server for processing. If I click on Google, the value that I set in the option opening tag is what is going to be sent to the server. If I click on external website, the value I have there is what's going to be sent to the website. So we've learned how to add a checkbox and then how to add an option element or a select element to a web page. Lastly, let's just see how to add a radio button, and that would be the end of our form creation process. So we're going to have a heading. Let me just write a H4 that says subscribe to our newsletter. Then let's start adding our radio button. So we'll need a label for our first option. There's a label that says yes, subscribe. In this label we have a 4 attributes that will say probably yes, subscribe. Then let's have our input element. So it follow the same syntax as we've done for previous input element. However, the type attribute will become radio. The name for this input element, we are going to keep it as subscribe. The ID for this input element will be the same as the 4, so yes, subscribe. Then we'll create another label for don't subscribe. So this is a label that will say don't subscribe. So we have a 4 attributes that we are just going to say no subscription. That's a long text, but let's keep it this way. Right, so we have our input element. Inside this input element we'll have our type attribute. Then we specify the type as a radio. The name of this input element become the same, subscribe. The ID of this input element would be no subscription, and that should be it. Let's visit our web page to see how this is displayed. So when I visit my web page and reload, you see we have our subscription UI displaying here. So subscribe to our newsletter with an option for the user to subscribe or not to subscribe. So these are the options you are giving to the user. Once you click on yes, subscribe, it's going to be highlighted. We click on don't subscribe, it switches to the next one. So here we're giving the user to select an option from related options. Let me review the whole process again, and then we'll bring this lesson to a close. So what do we need to create a form on our web page? We'll need a form element. Inside the form element, we'll need our input element and then a label element. So what kind of form do you want to display to the user? It's a sign up form. Then define the various data item that is required for the user to sign up to your service. If it's a contact us form, define the various data item that you want the user to enter before they can contact you. Okay, so here we start with a contact us form that would have a label for the full name and then an input element. Once you specify the type as text, then it means that the user can enter a text as their full name. We have a name attribute that help us to know the name for this data item, and then we have a placeholder that displays some text, dummy text, or some text that allows the user, a placeholder that guides the user as the data that they need to enter. Then we have the required attribute, meaning that this is required before the form is submitted. Move on to the next one. We have a label element. We have our input element. But check this out. The type here is email. This lets the web browser knows that the person needs to enter a valid email. Then we move on to the next one. We have a subject label. The type is text, and then it follows the same convention as we've done previously. Then let's go to the one that was a little bit different. We wanted to enter a large block of text, so we can't use our input element. This time around, we go for the text area. So the text area allows you to enter a large chunk of text, and then we have our label. Then we learned how to add our checkbox. How do we add a checkbox? You need to indicate the type to be checkbox for you to have a checkbox on your form. We also learned how the user can select an option from a variety of options on your form. So we'll need a select element to wrap the select element around our options element. For each of the option elements, we would now indicate the name for that option and then the value, what the user needs to click on or select for the data to be sent to the server. So the option element would have a value attribute, and then you set the value for the value attribute, and then you have your name that you want to display on the form. Then we learned how to add a radio element to our form. So here it follows the same syntax, however the type now becomes radio. So once you indicate the type as radio, the web browser knows that they need to display a radio button. And finally, we have a button element that will allow us to submit our form to the server. All right, folks, thank you for taking time to watch this video. If you found value in this video, please subscribe to the channel. And if you need any clarification, kindly drop a comment. I'll be sure to reply to you. Keep coding.